Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this webinar on advancing environmental justice in ASEAN, leveraging and operationalizing the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment declaration. My name is Simone Boneschi for UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub, and I will moderate today's session, which is co-organized by UNDP and Macquarie University Environmental Law Research Center. So we meet today at a significant moment. Just 7 weeks ago at the 47 ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur, member states adopted 2 landmark declarations that together will hopefully mark a new chapter for human rights and environmental governance in our region. The ASEAN Declaration on the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment recognizes the right to a healthy environment as a human right, responding to the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. In doing so, it also positions ASEAN within a broader global movement. As you may know, in July 2022, the UN General Assembly, also following the Human Rights Council, adopted Resolution 76-300, recognizing for the first time the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment as a universal human right. The ASEAN Declaration, therefore, builds on this global recognition while grounding it in regional commitments and mechanisms. It calls on member states to advance implementation of environmental law, promote core procedural rights, for example, access to information, public participation, access to justice, and protect people in vulnerable situations, including women, children, persons with disabilities, as well as indigenous people and local communities. Adopted alongside the right to healthy environment declaration, also the declaration promoting the right to development and the right to peace towards realizing inclusive and sustainable development, which reinforce the interconnection between sustainable development, human rights, and also regional stability, noting the intersection of business, human rights, environment, and climate change. While today we focus mainly on the right to healthy environment, we will also explore these important linkages. Our distinguished panel will help us unpack 3 key questions. What does this declaration mean for affected communities? How can soft law translate into concrete pathways for environmental justice? And finally, what mechanisms exist or need to be created to ensure accountability? So before we begin, I would like to note that we will be running a continuous poll to hear your views. The first question should be on your screen. What is the biggest barrier to environmental accountability in Asia? And we kindly ask you to take a moment to submit your response. And while you do that, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Today we have Edmund Bon Tyson, Malaysia representative to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, who brings direct insight into the negotiation and adoption process. We have Surya Deva, UN Special Rapporteur on the right to development, who will help us to understand how environmental and development rights intersect. We have R2HE, co-founder of Climate Action Malaysia, representing the voice of frontline communities and future generation. We have also Pratana Rao, Program Manager for Business Human Rights at Forum Asia, who will bring civil society and corporate accountability perspective. And finally, Joan Carling, Global Executive Director of Indigenous Peoples Rights International, who will address the critical dimension of indigenous rights and environmental protection. So I'm not sure the poll has been completed. No response yet, so we will show the results later on. So I would like to start immediately with the first round of questions. So let's start with Edmund, as you were directly involved in the negotiation process. So let me start with you on the journey that brought us here. So work on this declaration began a while ago, in early 2000, and in fact the Commission tried to adopt the declaration already in 2009, but this was not successful. So could you please elaborate a bit on the process? Why did it take so long and why did it succeed this time around? Over to you, Edmund.
Thank you very much, all of the organizers and UN and Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, okay. This declaration actually is the second declaration of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. The first declaration was the 2012 ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. The Environmental Rights Declaration started in 2021 under Thailand's leadership as proponent, supported by Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. So it has taken to 2021, 2022, and 2023. There were 5 working group meetings, and the working group meetings had experts including UNEP, OHCHR, civil society, biodiversity experts, and ASEAN bodies. We have differing levels of laws on environmental protection and human rights. We have differing definitions, and some of the procedural and substantive matters that we look to internationally are still absent in some of our jurisdictions. For example, Malaysia does not have a federal law on freedom of information, and that's still being developed. There is a largely absent common definition in ASEAN as to who a human rights defender is. There are still some contested definitions also as to the use of Indigenous Peoples. But fortunately, we were able, during our chairship in 2025, that was one of our key performance indexes for human rights at the Commission, to complete it. And you see a document there, while non-binding, while not being a treaty, but really aspirations that at the moment ASEAN member states don't even have in our laws. And if you compare that to what the UN has, the Human Rights Council, the GA, the resolutions are there supporting capacity building, supporting resource mobilization, supporting alignment of laws. In our region, I can say that comparatively with other regions, I think we have taken quite a positive step, and it is now the question of how we implement it. So it's not taken a very long time. It's taken 2 or 3 years, but I think the process was very important. We had a lot of civil society experts, including the UN bodies, OHCHR as well, providing those inputs. We had an open session also where we shared the draft, and you can still see it online. I think it's a May draft. We had more than 150 stakeholder inputs in writing, and the working group went through it, and we had a few rounds of negotiations. So I'll just leave it as that to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund, for sharing the history and the key context of the declaration. I would like now to bring in Pratana, as you are a civil society practitioner. You actually work on a daily basis on turning regional commitment into concrete change. So let me turn to you on what this declaration can actually deliver. As also highlighted by Edmund, this is a soft law instrument. It's not legally binding. However, how can this declaration actually lead to concrete pathways for environmental justice across ASEAN member states? Over to you.
Thank you, Simone. I hope everyone can hear me. I think what Edmund was saying is a great starting off point, because I think ASEAN declarations are often described as being soft law instruments, but soft law does not mean no impact. And I think it just takes the right anchors and leverage points to sort of take off from soft laws and actually implement actionable next steps. So this declaration on the right to a safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment is precisely one of those anchors. I think by firstly recognizing environmental protection as a fundamental human right, ASEAN has already aligned itself with global developments and also raised the moral baseline in some ways across all ASEAN member states. Because once there's a shared norm, a shared alignment where this right is recognized, inaction becomes harder to justify. So I think the question at this point is, how do we use the leverage points and the anchors that flow from the declaration for further action? And I think the first leverage point is actually institutional, because for the first time, ICHR is also tasked with developing the regional plan of action on environmental rights. And this is a critical shift because it helps us move from aspiration to actual implementation. And this regional plan of action can actually translate the declaration into concrete commitments, whether that's in the form of priorities, timelines, indicators, responsibilities. So this is one hope to actually implement next steps in actualizing the declaration. And if this regional plan of action is designed well, it can serve as a very practical framework to even guide national actions at the ASEAN level. The second leverage point is actually programmatic. And I think this aligns really well because ICHR is about to start implementing its 5-year work plan from 2026 to 2030, and also its priority programs for 2026. So embedding environmental rights into these different programmatic areas would be a way to ensure that there is sustained regional action on environmental rights, whether it's through capacity building, engagement with member states, or even coordination across different ASEAN bodies. So that's another leverage point with the work plan. The third leverage point is, of course, the ASEAN's long-term vision document, which is the ASEAN Vision 2045, which commits to the region being resilient, innovative, dynamic, and people-centered. And it is this last thing of people-centered which gives the declaration leverage, because development cannot be actualized if people and communities are excluded from any environmental decision-making, if they lose land, if their livelihoods suffer, if their air, water is contaminated. So this people-centered aspect of the environment, of the ASEAN vision, is another leverage point. Then there's also, of course, the external legal anchor, which was a huge change, which was the recent ICJ Climate Advisory Opinion, which reinforces environmental protection. And it says that it is inseparable from states' own human rights obligations. So while ASEAN instruments are not binding, I think this global jurisprudence with the ICJ opinion sort of also strengthens the weight of the declaration and can be used to guide courts, legal systems within ASEAN across the region. And this brings me to my last point, which is around ASEAN's responsibility in engaging with civil society. For the declaration to deliver real impact, I think ASEAN institutions need to ensure meaningful, safe, continuous engagement with communities, environmental defenders, indigenous peoples, civil society organizations, because these actors provide the grounded evidence on an environmental harm, early warnings and of emerging risks, practical insights into what works on the ground and what doesn't. So this is essential for effective implementation, monitoring, and accountability. So this requires ASEAN to guarantee things like access to information, participation, which is actually there in the declaration already, and the protection of human rights defenders. So these are sort of the enabling conditions. And I think taken together, all of these leverage points and anchors mean that the soft law can be translated into further action in a very concrete way. So I don't, the fact that it isn't binding, I think, isn't the end game. The question is whether ASEAN will seize this moment to turn it into sort of real pathways for environmental justice across the region. And of course, this needs institutional commitment, it needs political will, it needs a clear path, and it needs sustained hard work into mainstreaming into national agendas. But I think it's very much possible that the soft law can be turned into something more. So I think I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Simone.
Thank you, Pratana. So you raise very critical points about effective national implementation. This is why I want now to move to the Philippines, to Joanne, as this country offers a compelling example of how environmental rights can be operationalized through national legal mechanism. In this particular case, I'm referring, for example, to the Writ of Kalikasan under the Supreme Court's 2010 Rules of Procedures for Environmental Cases. So, Joanne, how can the ASEAN Declaration reinforce the use of mechanisms like this to hold, for example, polluters accountable? Over to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, at least now we can zoom in at the national level. So the Philippines demonstrate that the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment can move beyond principle and operationalized through concrete legal mechanisms. The Writ of Kalikasan, established under the Supreme Court's 2010 Rules of Procedures for Environmental Cases, is a powerful example of how courts can provide access to justice and accountability when environment harms reaches a serious and large-scale level. The ASEAN Declaration on the Right to Clean, Healthy, and Sustainable Environment can reinforce the use of national mechanisms like the Writ of Kalikasan in several important ways. First, ASEAN R2HE strengthens the regional legitimacy of judicial enforcement of environmental rights. When the Philippine courts issue Writ of Kalikasan, they are often challenged politically for allegedly obstructing development. ASEAN's recognition of environmental rights helps reframe these court actions as part of a shared regional human rights commitment and not against sustainable development. It demonstrates that environmental protection and development should go hand in hand. Second, ASEAN R2HE can reinforce accountability for polluters, including corporations operating across borders. Many of the Writ of Kalikasan cases involve mining, infrastructure, and energy projects by corporations and backed by powerful economic interests. A regional declaration affirms that environmental harm, especially as it affects communities across provinces, areas, or ecosystems, is a rights violation, not merely a regulatory issue, and that states have the duty to regulate corporate conduct effectively. So this also aligns to the UN guiding principles on human rights. Then third, ASEAN R2HE can promote regional learning from concrete cases, particularly those brought by Indigenous peoples and environmental defenders. For example, these are the cases in the Philippines. In Palawan, Indigenous communities and environmental defenders filed a Writ of Kalikasan against a large-scale nickel mining in Mount Mantalingahan protected landscape, arguing that mining threatened biodiversity, watersheds, and ancestral lands. The case highlighted the failure of state agencies to protect a protected area and indigenous territories. In cases involving reclamation projects and major infrastructure, including coastal and marine ecosystems relied upon by fishing and indigenous peoples communities, courts have issued Writ of Kalikasan based on the precautionary principle, recognizing that credible threats of irreversible damage are sufficient to trigger protection. That means the law is there to also protect, not just to respond when serious environmental harms have already taken place. These cases show that environmental defenders are not opposing development. We are defending life, ecosystems, and rights where regulatory systems have failed. Fourth, ASEAN R2HE can reinforce the protection of indigenous peoples and free, prior, and informed consent. Many Writ of Kalikasan petitions arise where projects proceeded without free, prior, and informed consent of affected communities. So FPIC is not a formality, but rather a right. ASEAN's recognition of environmental rights provides an additional layer of support for the argument that environmental protection, indigenous land rights, and self-determination are inseparable. Ultimately, ASEAN R2HE should not remain a declaratory commitment. It should strengthen national courts, protect environment defenders, and reinforce legal tools like the Writ of Kalikasan so that polluters are held accountable and communities are not forced to bear the cost of destructive development. I leave it there.
Yeah, Thank you, Joanne. So we have heard about these very important legal frameworks and mechanisms in the Philippines to protect people and communities from environmental harm. So I would like now to move to Malaysia and ROE, as you also work directly with those on the front lines of environmental harm. So the declaration specifically notes the differentiated impact on ethnic minorities, indigenous people, and local community. So ROE, how do you see this translating to tangible justice outcomes for the communities you work with in Malaysia? Over to you.
Whenever we talk about this declaration, promoting this declaration to communities on the ground, the first thing that they would ask is this declaration legally binding or not? Because that seems to be one of the biggest concern. I think the other panels can agree as well. This is a question that constantly is brought up. But this declaration itself is not worthless. Like Edmund said, this is a very positive move. What communities need to understand is that they actually create a lot of political leverage, and that matters a lot when we work on the ground. So with this declaration, we as civil societies can now hold governments accountable to the commitments that they have made publicly. Especially for Malaysia, because all of these processes were very much focused in Malaysia as well. And legal advocates can actually cite this R2HE declaration in constitutional cases. And communities can now use this language when developers show up at their doorsteps. And most importantly, now that we have the regional plan of action going on, this will create an ongoing process, and also it's an opportunity for us and the civil society to continue push for concrete implementation. And from Kami's work on the ground, we see exactly how this needs to be happen. Let me illustrate you one example. With the indigenous communities that we work with, when they found out that this declaration was coming up, they actually had a newfound spirit in tackling all these new emerging issues like energy transition, carbon offsets, and all these greenwashing schemes, because they say that this gives them hopes and leverages all of these issues. And a lot of the workshops that we did this year with workers, informal workers, women, throughout May and November at the ASEAN Summit, one thing was clear. While the ASEAN was adopting this declaration, frontline communities were already experiencing how the energy transition itself is reproducing the same colonial extractive patterns that we are trying to escape. We're talking issues like nickel mining for batteries, solar farm for land grabs, and also exploitative labor condition, even in green industries. So what are the tangible outcomes that we are fighting for using this declaration? Number one, anti-SLAPP legislation, so people can actually speak up without being bankrupted by lawsuits. Binding FPIC protocols and not just tick box consultations. And we also talk about gender quotas in energy transition decision making, but also climate governance bodies and also environmental impact assessment panels. And most importantly, accessible grievance mechanisms that actually work. So these are the things that need to be in our local policies, and we can now use this R2HE declaration to push for them. So I wouldn't say that this declaration is an endpoint, but this is definitely a leverage point for our advocacy work. And I feel like this is what communities need right now in the face of emerging new issues with the climate crisis.
Thank you, Aroy, for indicating these very important, also practical tools for protection and remedies. Now, before we move to second round, I would like to hand over to Surya and bring you in briefly. Surya, you have heard the perspective from the Commission, from civil society, indigenous rights, in case of Aroy from frontline communities. So from your current position as a special rapporteur, what would you add? And in particular, how might this declaration be leveraged to strengthen recognition and protection of environmental human rights defenders, who also highlighted by previous panelists often face significant risk in this work? So over to you, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shimoni. And I think the fellow panelists have articulated a strong case that why this declaration could be a path-breaking document going forward. Let me add two broad points. The first is that we have a number of soft law declarations in the history of human rights that have become very powerful. Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a soft law instrument and it's very powerful. We also have UNDRIP, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is also a very powerful instrument. And more recently, we have UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. All these are concrete examples of soft law becoming very powerful in practice. On the other hand, we see that the hard law in international human rights law is breached every day. So sometimes hard law can be violated every day, and the soft law may be implemented in practice. So this artificial distinction between soft versus hard, we should have a more nuanced understanding on that particular issue. But I want to add one more point, and that is there has been a criticism of this declaration that it does not acknowledge the role of environmental human rights defenders. And I think it's a legitimate criticism. But at the same time, we should be creative. And I would like to mention three concrete entry points in the text of the declaration that provides environmental human rights defenders and civil society generally to engage with the process. First is paragraph number 2.1. It talks about that ASEAN states have to consider this declaration in the context of all relevant international standards. And that will bring in UN guiding principles, that will bring in UN DRIP, that will bring in UDHR and all other instruments, in my view. So that is first entry point. Secondly, paragraph number 2.3, it talks about access to information, it talks about meaningful public participation, and it talks about access to justice. Any of these could not be achieved without the critical role of environmental human rights defenders. So that is the second entry point we should be leveraging. The third is paragraph 8. It talks about role of relevant stakeholders in terms of peer learning, articulating solutions and multi-stakeholder initiatives. And again, who will deny that environmental human rights defenders and civil society generally is a relevant stakeholder at all levels, local, national, regional, and international level. So in my view, we should be using the creative interpretation of this soft declaration to achieve all the goals that we would like to achieve going forward. I will leave it at this point of time, Simone. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. And let me also reiterate that indeed many principles enshrined today in soft laws are also binding as a use cogens, customary law. So this is an important note. So thank you for this rich opening discussion. So we have heard about the declaration journey, its potential despite being soft law, how national mechanism can translate the declaration into enforceable rights and what it means for affected communities and also frontline human rights defenders. So let's now turn to the second part of this discussion, to how the Right to Health Environment Declaration connects to the broader development agenda, particularly through its companion declaration, the Right to Development. So as mentioned, both declarations were adopted at the same summit and both reference the impact of business operation on the environment. So let me turn to Edmund and then directly to Surya to address the same question. So Edmund, from the AICHR perspective, and Surya, from your mandate as Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, what does effective coordination look like between sectoral bodies dealing with environment, development, human rights, and labor? So Edmund, over to you, and then directly to Surya.
Thank you very much. Just two quick points. The Right to Development Declaration that was proposed by Malaysia, we wanted to deepen the engagement and the emphasis on multiple vulnerabilities and multiple intersectionalities of groups in vulnerable and marginalized situations. So the preamble links environmental damage, climate change to this issue of vulnerabilities directly. And in terms of the second point, international cooperation, I think what's very important is there is a lack of understanding, especially in our region, as to what the right to development means. So Surya has come to a lot of our programs, and he has come up with a framework. We wanted to emphasize that development is not just economic development, it's a civil, political, social, cultural development as well. And what the right to development also means, specifically in the context of climate change, is that we in Southeast Asia, while we are smaller countries, we need to be assisted. We need international cooperation. And you can see our statements at the climate change conferences, COP, how I think developed countries or nations are expected to support developing nations in our region. And I think we need to really emphasize it. So the right to development, some argue, say that it's not only it's not only an obligation, it's not only a responsibility. Some argue that there is a duty for developed nations to actually support developing nations. And this is how I think the in terms of climate change and environment, the right to development declaration is important. And also why we were moving it was because of the conflicts that we have in the region, how sustainable development is stunted by conflict. We need real peace, but also that we need to emphasize that groups in vulnerable situations are not just passive beneficiaries, but are also central active agents that their rights need to be protected. That would include migrant workers, it would include human rights defenders, and all of these groups. So I just want to leave it there very quickly, and I'll pass it on to Surya. I think in really one word, I think the region has missed many opportunities for many years now to talk about and advocate right to development in a way that we have this year. And I think that was one of our priorities of Malaysia, not just emphasizing what economic development means. So it's not a precondition to development. All must be emphasized together. And I understand that there is also a binding treaty that may be coming up. So this is something which I think the region embraces and operationalizes in our own ASEAN way. Pass it back to you.
Thank you, Edmund. And I will build on it. That it is very crucial to underscore that right to development, if it is properly understood, right to environment is very much compatible, is kind of consistent with this, because right to development does not entail the right to destroy the environment or right to destroy the planetary boundaries. So I think that is a crucial thing. And that's why these two declarations should be seen together. They're creating this harmony with nature and the idea of a sustainable development in practice. But Simone, you asked a very practical question in terms of how we can operationalize the coordination. In my view, both right to environment as well as right to development are cross-cutting issues. And this coordination, collaboration is needed at multiple levels. Let me start with the civil society. They are civil society organizations who may focus on certain issues. Let's say someone focusing on gender equality, someone focusing on climate change, someone focusing on indigenous peoples' rights. I think they need to work together. So we need better coordination, a more holistic approach among civil society organizations, and a greater collaboration with trade unions. That's my first point of collaboration. Secondly, we need better collaboration amongst different government ministries and agencies, not at the national level alone, but also at all three or two tiers of governance in different countries: national, provincial level, local, state level. We can go to third tier where we're talking about villages, towns, municipalities. That is crucial. The third is UN agencies. UN agencies also need to collaborate better, in my view, rather than having a mindset of each having a particular agenda and a boundary. That is crucial. And Edmund highlighted international cooperation, and I will finish with that, that it is absolutely critical that we should not see ASEAN as a compartment. ASEAN has to work closely with other regions. IHR has to work with other peers in different regions, and that's where the collaboration between the global north and the south, south and south collaboration, and the triangular collaboration is going to become absolutely vital to ensure that we take this declaration from paper to practice. Over to you, Shimoni. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Edmund and Surya, for highlighting this critical interconnection and all the required, I would say, layers of coordination, collaboration, and cooperation. So, Surya, just a quick follow-up question also, again, for you, because I want to build on your last point. So let me press further on the corporate accountability dimension, which is an area where significant gaps remain between commitments and enforcement. So in your opinion, what mechanism exists or should be developed to ensure that development does not come at the cost of human rights and the environment?
Businesses are often part of the problem, and I think we need to address the root causes. And one way to address root causes is we need to create better business models, in my view. Those business models that respect the environment, that respects the rights of the communities, including of indigenous peoples, respect FPIC, and they move beyond this idea of consultation. Because the idea of consultation is not working in my view. We need participation, which is active, free, and meaningful. Businesses have to co-create solutions with the communities rather than see communities as the adversary. And I think that is where the governments also need to come into picture. So going forward, I very much hope that these declarations are used better by national human rights institutions. They're used better in court cases. And I think my co-panelists, both John and others, highlighted how this can be done in practice. But I also would like to challenge the IHR, and Edmund has been great this year to take this leadership, and I very much hope that his colleagues in future take that leadership forward so that we don't just have tides of leadership up and down, high tide, low tide, rather that the high tide that we have seen this year continues next year. IHR, for instance, can study systemic issues both about environment and development and do some studies that highlight systemic challenges and provide concrete recommendations to IHR member states to implement these two declarations. IHR can also play a very crucial role like a post office. It can receive complaints and then it can redirect those complaints to NHRIs, to national contact points, to different government ministries, and so on and so forth. And finally, and I will finish with that, IHR should collaborate very closely with regional human rights institutions of other regions because businesses in ASEAN are also coming from outside ASEAN. And I think that is where that collaboration is quite crucial. So businesses should be harnessed to be a part of a positive change going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, for your additional comments. And we all agree on the need for a different business model and your positive notes on a stronger role for IHR. Let me now bring in again ROE. So ROE 2025 has been also a landmark year for youth advocacy on climate and environmental justice, including the notorious ICJ advisory opinion on climate obligation, which was indeed initiated by law students from Pacific Islands. So from your work with the youth, especially young women and girls, how does this intergenerational framing help revealing intersecting barriers related to age, related to gender, related to power, and what does this mean for development choices in the ASEAN? Thank you.
Yeah, so we know the ICJ advisory opinion confirms that these countries have real legal duties to cut emissions and protect people from climate harm. But here's the questions that we need to ask. Legal duties to protect whom exactly, and who gets to decide what climate action looks like. So from our work in the region, what comes clearly is this disconnect. So from our engagement and research, we see people being told that they are developing green energy or cleaner energy for them, but these young people have zero power to shape what development actually looks like for them. And there are no guaranteed seats at the table, at decision making tables for affected community, for women who bear the consequences of these projects, who bear climate impacts, for workers who are transitioning in these industries. So I think the intergenerational framing in the ICJ opinion is very powerful because it exposes about power imbalances, about structural exclusion. So it's not just about being consulted, but it's about having actual decision making power. So right now, ASEAN's development model still has decision about energy infrastructure and land use being made by those who don't bear the worst consequences. So we know that women face particular barriers, unpaid care work that blocks access to green jobs, health and safety risks in renewable energy projects that aren't even being monitored. They're being excluded from planning processes despite being at the front line of climate impacts. So what does this mean for ASEAN's development? So if we take the ICJ obligations and intergenerational rights seriously, we need structural inclusion in climate governance, environmental impacts assessment panels, and the implementation of both the R2HE declaration and our national action plans on business and human rights. Malaysia's net BHR is there on paper, but unless we build meaningful participation mechanisms, these frameworks will continue to exclude the people who are bearing the most consequences. And that's what justice under the R2HE declaration should look like.
Thank you, Roy, for your very important remarks, and also to all the panelists for all this perspective, highlighting the complexity of balancing development with environmental and human rights protection. So we have covered a lot of ground, and I know the audience has started to submit questions in the chat. So let's now open the floor. We have about around 15 minutes, 20 if people want to stay longer. So let's start from collect some of the questions. Maybe we should try to cluster some of them, but so there is a question on AI. So for example, in what ways can AI contribute to the development of enabling conditions that align government reform across ASEAN institutions in support of environmental justice? So let's start maybe to address the question AI, and then we cluster a couple of questions for the panelists. So I don't know who wants to answer the question of AI, because this stands a bit alone in out of all the other questions. So who's brave enough to answer a question of AI? Okay, Pratana, over to you. Thank you.
I'm not brave enough, but from what I know, I just wanted to tackle some of the ways AI can be used. And I'm one of those skeptical people that doesn't necessarily think that AI should be the answer for everything. But I do think that that there is value that it can add. And I think number one, of course, is around making provisions in the declaration and following national agendas more accessible. Because I think we have always struggled with translation of these documents as the number one barrier in preventing access to information to rural communities, to indigenous communities. And I think that is something that AI slowly can help with, to at least make access to information more accessible. And I think there is, beyond that, I think there is a role for AI to eventually play in sort of cross pillar, if that's the word, data integration, which sort of links environmental data with human rights reporting data, with investment data, with climate commitments, and sort of creating a database of this, and helps us analyze any early warning risks that might be coming up. So I think that is something that AI can be strategically used for as well. And yeah, the last one is connected to that, which is around early warning systems and risk flagging systems, where I think that with the kind of an escalating environmental harm happening in the region, there is a role for AI to play in ensuring that there are systems in place that allow us to identify harm before they happen. But I think all of this is under the caveat that the use of AI in data centers is highly problematic. Like AI as a tool is just contributing to land dispossession, environmental harm, indigenous peoples' rights being violated. And the more we rely on it, it can also be very, very problematic. So I think it has to be a cost-benefit analysis that is done to ensure that AI is not just used for the sake of using AI. And it has to be weighed really carefully. So that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratana, for this input on the critical role of generative AI and large language models to fill in some of the gaps, particularly in relation to access to information. So now I would like to hand over to you a question related to business and human rights, because we have a couple of questions which are related to the role of business and private sector. So the first one, given the non-binding nature of the new ASEAN Declaration and emerging trends on mandatory due diligence in major trading partners, to what extent will the European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and other human rights due diligence law impose an indirect mandate on ASEAN member states and their exporting business, compelling a more rigorous and timely operationalization of the right to health environment principles vis-a-vis international trade competitiveness? So this is one. Maybe we can merge this with this one. What approaches do you consider most effective for pushing business to align with this declaration and integrate environmental impact assessment into the operation? So, yeah, over to you. I mean, this is clearly a question for all of you. So, Joanne, please, over to you.
I think the ASEAN 2HE are still a useful way to demand accountability of business. In particular, I think communities can really assert the need to make corporations accountable by first doing human rights due diligence, and also the environment, the ESG, environmental and social governance, where it requires participation, especially by affected communities, and because in many cases, indigenous communities are not even allowed to. They are not even can express the impacts, for example, of destructive projects in terms of their the cultural dimension, where a lot of the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples, both tangible and intangible, are affected. And and that's also the reason why there's a lot of conflicts with corporations, because they don't account for the adverse impacts to indigenous peoples, and that becomes a high reputational risk for companies. And many companies don't want to face reputational risk when there are so many conflicts in areas where they operate. So that's one way of persuading or pressuring companies to align themselves to the declaration. A second is also the need for them to establish effective and its part, that part is the redress mechanism, because that's also where we can test how serious companies are in their accountability, and the establishment of this of accountability mechanism, particularly grievance mechanisms that are accessible to communities, because many do not even have any kind of grievance mechanism, especially for projects in remote areas. So we need to have accessible grievance mechanisms where communities can actually file their complaint using their own language and having access to information that they need in terms of the violations committed by companies. So And so in our experience with dealing with companies, because many companies have their voluntary guidelines, voluntary due diligence, voluntary commitment. So it's really the push that we need to do, demand them to make themselves accountable, not only in words, but in real action. And this is where we also need to support communities to be able to exercise those and build their capacities to demand accountability by companies. So, and in relation, again, this has been mentioned several times, that for Indigenous peoples, the free, prior, and informed consent is the social license for companies to operate, and any violation of free, prior, and informed consent should not be tolerated.
Thank you, John, for your feedback. If other panelists want to integrate, otherwise we move to another question, because we can see from the chat a lot of questions actually are around accountability. So accountability for environmental human rights defenders, accountability for Indigenous people. So we have highlighted here a quite interesting question, which from an anonymous attendee says, my understanding is that the ASEAN Declaration is a political statement rather than a binding treaty with commitments. So since the creation of a full-fledged sanction imposing legal body seems politically improbable, how can ASEAN realistically operationalize the right to health environment by strengthening procedural safeguards and reputational consequence within the ASEAN way? And then he continues. So maybe, I don't know if Edmund or...
Surya is raising his hand.
Sorry, I cannot see Surya because I have the... Okay, sorry. You were covered completely by question and answer. Surya, over to you.
That's okay. I mean, this question, Edmund can also jump in. I was trying to very briefly respond to the accountability question that you were talking about earlier. In my view, there are many things. I mean, accountability remains a serious gap, not just in ASEAN, but all over the world. Let us face it, right? And there is no silver bullet. There is no magic solution. But I'm just going to mention a couple of concrete ideas how these two declarations can be leveraged. First is that these declarations can be directly integrated into the actual impact assessment and human rights due diligence done by businesses. Or when the governments are issuing licenses for projects, civil society must be insisting whether the government is considering the implications of those declarations, right? And I think that is where HR or national human rights institutions can play a crucial role in facilitating those dialogues between the government agencies, businesses, and the communities. The second thing which may be relevant going forward is, can shadow impact assessment be done? For instance, businesses or external consultants do all the time impact assessment or due diligence. And my experience is they are not always respecting FPIC and all that Joan mentioned, right? So can civil society do a shadow or alternative impact assessment of the same project and try to highlight that, look, this is what it should really look like in practice? They may not have the resources, and I think that's where UN agencies should support those civil society groups, in my view, and that can contribute to accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. And Edmund, do you want to integrate?
Yeah, just quickly. Just quickly. So ASEAN as a regional body, we have a whole, and ICHA has a whole lot of meetings. We meet for almost, last year we met 6 times a year, the highest for the commission. And at every meeting, it's about 4 days. We have to meet in Jakarta as well. And then on top of those meetings, we have something like 20 programs a year. So those 20 programs will be 2 days. So we meet each other very often. But what happens in ASEAN, which is unseen, and while I take the point about legally binding treaties and about how it will contribute better, effectively. I think there's emerging academic literature about how soft law and the way that regional mechanism works. So in these meetings, what happens is we have a declaration, high level, macro. We have a plan of action. Sometimes it's called RPA. Sometimes it's called different names, operational guidelines or whatever. And then we have a monitoring and evaluation mechanism. So regularly in the meeting, while there are sometimes self-assessments, there are also external assessments of our work. How we can robustly make this declaration a bit more evaluative, a bit more qualitative, really depends on how strong the RPA is. So we would really encourage civil society to use the opportunities to bring forth what you would suggest the RPA can have. And we are actually in Manila trying to discuss it now. We're trying to look towards, on my part, not as a commission, we're thinking to try and complete it by July, and have a multi-sectorial consultation with a lot of different inputs. So the RPA will then look at the 6 substantive rights and also the 3 main substantive procedural rights. The reporting is very important, and we can only do reporting, like what Surya said, if we have a communication mechanism. ICHA this year has now formalized a communication mechanism. Recently, we are going to publish our guidelines, and you can actually raise those cases, raise those issues, and it will be passaged through the particular representative, and then that can be used as part of the reporting. People can ask questions on the reporting. My own personal feeling is that we need to have really an open, high-level dialogue where we can actually raise these issues with ASEAN member states. So while there is a hard law, we are familiar with the treaty reporting mechanisms, we are familiar with the UPR, we actually have similar reporting mechanisms in ASEAN, although we have soft law. And although not as robust, we have mechanisms that allow for these type of questions and answers to be very productive. And the last one you can see was what we have hosted. We called it the 7 ASEAN Human Rights Dialogue. We talked about the environment, we talked about digital rights, women and children, online harm, and we talked about right to development. So we want to try and expand it. We are still learning. It's of course not a similar system as the UN, but we bear in mind we are an association, a regional association. We are not a supranatural body like the EU. I just leave it as that.
Thank you, Edmond. Maybe we can, as we are almost at 3 p.m., so maybe the last questions. I know you started already to answer, Edmond, but I can see a lot of questions also are interlinked with, accountability framework, moving from soft to binding regulation. So I would like to highlight this question. So what will the process to develop the regional action plan look like? Because some CSOs were disappointed with the consultation process, for example, to develop the declaration. So what assurance can HR give to the process, that the process to develop the regional action plan will actually involve meaningful engagement with society stakeholders? And there are also other questions on the intergenerational system. How do we ensure that perspective of women, youth, children implementation will be considered? So actually, the effective implementation action plan. Maybe you can integrate a bit, and maybe other panelists may also say something, and then we close with the poll. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to deal with this critique, which to us in Malaysia, we are fine with. I've said, you can criticize the declaration, you can praise the declaration, you can welcome it, you can applaud it. But I want to deal with 2 issues. One, the declaration process since 2021 has actually been quite open. For the first time, ICHA has had a working group. That working group has UNEP, OHCHR, UNSCAP, it had civil society, indigenous groups, ASEAN Youth Forum, and it had experts. Some of you were there. Some of you know that while there were very tense proceedings, just as how UN treaty negotiations are, there was a process that was open, and that was an experiment, which I think has been successful for the first time in ASEAN. So it's not entirely accurate to say that it was not an open process. Number two, we actually had the declaration up online and we had invited written inputs. We received something like 150 over written inputs. Royal Wallenberg Institute had actually done a written report and summarized the input for further discussions. That's why a lot of the things in the declaration have come from those inputs. That process may be replicated, but I think we want to make sure that that process is better governed. So we are actually still discussing how we're going to have a more open process. The second issue is I hear that there is a constant, and I've just seen a comment just now. It's nothing personal, but I accept that there is the same two comments that continually be made. I know they are welcoming of the declaration from UN experts, including Surya, but the two declarations about environmental human rights defenders that is not stated, and about indigenous people. These were very two contested language, and there are some countries that were not happy about it. But you have seen that for the first time in an ASEAN declaration on a human rights issue, we have managed, and this was my language as chair, to include the word indigenous, but it's of course indigenous and local communities at the moment, and where it says where relevant, applicable to ASEAN member states or something to that effect. That was the best compromise that we have got, and I will not blame any country for it. It's just that we could only get that negotiated. The point about it is that the term indigenous, which has been very difficult in ASEAN, has now appeared for the first time in an ASEAN human rights document. So build on that. Number two, when people say human rights defenders, we don't have a definition of human rights defenders. Even if you look at the Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights, on human rights defenders, the language about persons working to promote and protect human rights is there. We see that in the UN resolutions. So for us to say environmental human rights defenders means nothing to ASEAN because countries do not recognize or do not have a clear definition as to what that means. Again, I'm not being apologetic, but I'm saying that in reality, while we recognize human rights defenders, we also recognize that that legal definition connotes many different things to many different countries. So it is a question about whether we want to continue arguing about this language, and it was very contested, I can tell you, for the next 15 years, or I said, look, I need to finish this. That was our KPI. And the best language we got is persons working to promote and protect human rights. Now, the question is, what does that mean in the context of the RPA? And that is, it could be self-identification, it could be certain elements of what it is. If I ask any UN expert, I can ask Surya, what do you mean by environmental human rights defenders? Is there a clear definition? What would the answer be? So again, I'm not being defensive. I'm just saying that when there is critique, we will take fair critique. But when there is language there already acknowledging that we need to protect people who work to promote and protect human rights, then it's slightly a bit unfair when people say, oh, there's no explicit language for environmental human rights defenders or human rights defenders. But that is what it means. So that's just my quick explanation because I see some of those comments there. And I will continue to take that line because as I mentioned, we as practitioners, we are here trying to be very positive, trying to have a declaration for ASEAN for the first time after the declaration in 2012. So for something after 13 years, I can say that at the moment, this is the best that we could get. And now we should just build on it by operationalizing it through an RPA. I pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmond. So I would like now to hand over to panelists in case they have some final comments, also building on what Edmond just shared, and then moving to the closing and the poll. Joanne, over to you.
Thank you, Edmond. I know the controversy around the term indigenous peoples, and I think it's more important to have our rights recognized than fight over the words, because we know that indigenous peoples in Asia are described in different ways. Like indigenous communities, ethnic minorities, ethnic communities. I think the most fundamental is how for example, there's a guideline now on the customary land rights, and that is where that's the more important thing for us, how our land rights are protected, how our free, prior, and informed consent is done properly, so that our rights are protected and we can exercise these rights. And many of the ASEAN countries have indigenous peoples, and we've always been insisting that our collective rights should be recognized, especially now that we have a law on the protection of the environment. And the way we can only protect the environment if we also protect the ones protecting the environment, and that is the indigenous people. So for us, it's really the critical matter is not the words per se, not the language per se, but more importantly is the recognition and protection of our rights, so that we can continue to also protect the environment and defend the environment. So I just want to add that. But thank you, Edmond. I know you've done a lot for insisting that indigenous peoples be made visible in the ASEAN, and we of course support you, and we hope to work with you and the other commissioners to really push for the real recognition of our rights. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing as a strategy for RPA before Surya takes over? I've said this a few times after the negotiations, and I want to say this. Indigenous is an English word. I don't have indigenous in the English word in my constitution. Malaysia has always protected in our constitution the orang asli and orang asal, anak-anak negeri Sabah and Sarawak. I suggest in the RPA for each of our country to put our traditional language of what indigenous means in the RPA, because I've already given a pathway in the declaration. In the declaration, I say where relevant and applicable, I think it was taken out, applicable to ASEAN member states. So let ASEAN member states who don't have indigenous or think they don't have indigenous opt out. But for Malaysia, in the RPA, I will use the language my government uses. Orang asli, orang asal, anak-anak negeri Sabah and Sarawak. So why do we need to use the word IP? Why do I need to use the word English, the English term? Because the English term indigenous do not mean anything to me in Malaysia. I've kept saying this, and I kept asking UN experts. When I'm negotiating it, I want language. I added masyarakat adat for the Indonesian in the text. I can say that. That was taken out. But I'm using English text. So the word indigenous for me in Malaysia doesn't mean a thing, Joan. So maybe the RPA, I've asked the indigenous groups, give me all the terms in all the traditional 11 languages. And I am saying it now. It's not ICHA's position, but I'm very clear that I want to do this as Malaysia's position. So if that is acceptable, you use your traditional indigenous language of the Filipinos, of the Bruneians, of the Malaysians, where applicable, because the pathway is already there. And that's how we probably can make the RPA more effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmond. And Surya, please.
Thank you. I think the value of this webinar is already there, right? We need more of such discussions. We could see that already quite powerful exchange. And I hope we can post the recording online later on so that all others can benefit. Let me make this point. The context matters. We are talking about negotiating these two declarations in 2025, where multilateralism is collapsing significantly all over the world. The word gender equality, the term gender equality, is not agreeable anymore at the international multilateral level. So we need to understand that these two declarations, adoption of these in the ASEAN, where everything has to be done by consensus, is quite significant in my view, where the global political multilateral system is collapsing miserably to negotiate text. That's my first point. The second point of context is, and I think I will build on what Edmund is saying, we perhaps need more decolonial articulation of human rights, as well as articulation of rights of indigenous people. I think you were talking about that we need to move away from the colonial, extractive, and exploitative model, right? And I think that is where we need to define and own these standards that matter. And here I'm not challenging universality minded, right? But the point is that why our local ethos and the cultural traditions of indigenous peoples for centuries are not recognized the way they should be in the local decolonial context. So I think that context matters. And let me end with this, that let us work together to operationalize and leverage these two declarations in the context of the wider ecosystem, whether it's CSDDD, whether these are national action plans, whether these are the other treaty discussions that are unfolding. Don't see these declarations as a compartment. Consider these two declarations as part of the wider ecosystem, whether this ICJ advisory opinion, and so on and so forth. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Surya. And in case Pratana and Aroe, are you fine? We can close. You want to say something?
Yeah, just to say that I think in all this conversation, the one thing that I would also like to bring back is that we need to manage our expectations of what all these declarations can achieve. And I think to expect a singular declaration to be the answer to all our prayers is also might be expecting too much, and also sets unrealistic expectations for even communities and defenders that, oh, now that we have this declaration, it'll save us. And I think we need to do an analysis of how much energy and time to also put into I forgot, I can't pronounce the English word, but yeah, to making these declarations come true, and try and use like a multi-pronged approach that also uses other strategies beyond these declarations to try and ensure that the rights of communities and defenders are central to any discourse around the environment. These declarations can be supplementary in some cases, but in no way are they the one and only answer. So I think there's also a bit about managing our expectations and negotiating with everything that is out there to see what works for every context in every community. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratana. And final from Aroe. Thank you.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the declaration, I think people or civil societies tend to focus on, the gaps, what are the things that are not there. I think we've just been, so used to thinking about finding, analyzing gaps, right? But I think we also need to look into the opportunities, points of collaboration, going back to what Surya said about, being more creative in leveraging these tools and use it as an opportunity for us to actually, defend our rights.
Thank you. So we are now closing this session. I think you have summarized very well some of the key takeaways, so no need to elaborate on this. So thank you for this great discussion. Indeed, there are still complex questions we need to answer. Looking ahead, we recommend all the participants to stay engaged with your national HR representatives on the development of the regional plan of action called for in the declaration. Use the declaration language in national advocacy, litigation, and policy dialogue, and also connect with the organization represented by our panelists for continued engagement. From our side, we will, as requested, circulate the recording of this session. We will circulate the key takeaways, the results of the poll that we are not able to share today because of the time, and all the resource links after the session. And also we will try to answer some of the several questions which we were not able to address today, and we will do this by email. So stay engaged with UNDP, Macquarie University Future Dialogues, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you.